short term. To bring about that change that brings more liberty to the masses. I was having a discussion with a libertarian the other day.
More liberty to the masses.
Right.
What's that mean?
I mean, that could be, that's, well, sure, is that vapid? We know exactly what I'm talking about. Moving away from the regulatory state to a country that places emphasis on individual rights. Isn't that what we're talking about ultimately when we're talking about originalism? Let's talk about all these complicated cases about, bankruptcy and business that arrive at the Supreme Court level. You know what? I don't care. But what I do care about, I had a discussion with a libertarian the other day, keep Ron Paul or bust. I'm not going to vote for John McCain because he's not conservative, libertarian enough for me.
What's your question?
I'm not asking a question, I'm making a point. My point, we need to hitch our wagon to, so if you're saying we need to call a constitutional convention to change it, I understand logistically, that's what we want to do if we want to write a new document, write a new social contract, but I'm going to say as a pragmatist, that's not going to happen, ever. What we can do is we can hope, cross our fingers, that these liberal judges get hit by a bus. I'm just kidding, I don't hope that. And we replace them politically with people on the court that I would rather have an originalist understanding than a radical understanding of the Constitution. So I guess my point is between both of you why it's not necessarily in conflict. One will lead to the other. Having justices that take an originalism philosophy will ultimately lead to possibly a constitutional convention to bring about the changes that we want as the Federalist Society, as the law school Republicans.
I'm certainly sympathetic to a lot of what Professor Oesterle said. Roe versus Wade drives a lot of discussion about constitutional interpretation. I think Brown does a lot of that as well.
Yeah, I want to bring that up.
There's a lot of debates about definitions, which really aren't worth a whole lot. So I'm very sympathetic to a lot of that. I'm very sympathetic to what you were saying as well. One thing that caught my ear, though, in talking about one of Professor Oesterle's criticism of originalism is that it doesn't work. If we go back to the original meaning, then things are going to collapse, we're going to be displaced, I think was the claim. And then in response, Professor Oesterle's solution is, let's call it a new constitutional convention, which I'm with you. I think that is as unlikely to happen as me being the president next term. So it's not going to happen. And what is the second best alternative? I don't think it's the second best alternative. I think it's the best alternative, which is interpret the Constitution according to its original meaning, which it's easy to dismiss these different reasons to be originalists. But if you read them, I think what you'll find, and I know I'm persuaded by one of those, I won't say which one, that when you adopt originalism, it's going to lead to the most natural rights protection, which I think is something you can be sympathetic with. And I think it's certainly too early to discount the gains that originalists and originalists have made. So I mentioned 5 justices at the beginning of my talk who either consistently identify with or inconsistently identify with originalism. That means that 5 of the people who are making these very important decisions are originalists. And I think 2 years ago we had a great example of that, Heller versus District of Columbia, the Second Amendment case. That was, in some ways, a very revolutionary case. It went against the conventional wisdom, and it's going to continue to keep on producing precedent along that way. And if you believe that, for example, Heller is going to lead to more natural rights protection, I think that's something concrete that you can latch onto. I think that's something that, depending on, of course, the presidential administration and the political winds, if more originalists become judges, scholars, etc., that's much more likely to pay off than a constitutional convention, which I don't think is going to ever happen.
Well, let me just, the criticism I have, I agree. Constitutional convention, by the way, can have transitionary stuff in it. You've confused 2 terms. One is originalism and the other is conservatism or libertarianism. Pick one. That's the problem. Originalism is supposed to be a theory that does not have links to a political philosophy. It just is what it is. It leads you to go where you go.
Doesn't it link back to...
No, wait. But your view is, if I'm originalist, I am conservative.
Yeah.
Okay, that's false. That means, you could be originalist and a liberal. I mean, if you have... Originalism is politically neutral. You you are taking a political theory and driving it through a term and trying to use the term to get to where you want to go. And it ought not to do that. Now, so you pose the same problem. The liberals on the court, if you're putting people with political views on the court to get political policy decisions, and you assume by using originalism you'll get closer to where you want to go on the political spectrum. That to me is just as big a problem as the liberals. Same problem.
But at least
you just have a different name.
No, but I think, well, I think it's so right. If you're an originalist, you're going back to Lockean like classical liberalism, which only really jives with conservatism, libertarianism, or moderate squishy republicanism today. So I'm getting to
You're
where
sure about that?
I'm pretty darn sure. It's going to where, and you're by the way my favorite professor here, and I'll agree with you 90% of the time, except in this case.
I don't want students to agree with you. That's fine.
Well, my point
that scares
is,
me when they agree with you.
But my point is, if I'm packing the court with originalist judges, I'm not packing the court with Justice White. I mean, I'm not packing the court with Justice Stevens. I'm packing the court with people who will accomplish my ends through a philosophy that at least is fair, and the problems and the minutiae in the middle.
So the liberals aren't fair.
No, they're not.
So if you take the second from the bottom, the natural rights, if you take the arguments, Ray Barnett has a great book, Historical Lost Constitution, and if you take his historical claims as being true or accurate, which is that the Breakers and ratifiers embodied in the Constitution what he calls a presumption of liberty, which is a protection for natural rights, which would be a synonym for what you were talking about before, libertarianism, locking natural rights. If you embrace that, then that's certainly not going to be what we can understand as today conventional liberal. Now, there's a truth to the matter. Either Ray Barnett's right or Ray Barnett's wrong. And so I guess I think a facile dismissal of the equation of originalism with libertarianism requires one to read the arguments and say why they're wrong. I actually think Barnett's wrong, so I'm not actually in your camp, but I think that those are some very strong arguments that we can be.
You better read Locke pretty careful. I'm not sure he says what you think he says.
Other questions?
I've got one. Just if taking the Constitution as a contract, and supposing that at some point the federal government will exceed its limits that it was expressly delegated, isn't the natural remedy to have, as Thomas Jefferson said, have the states be duty-bound to resist, as he said in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798, where, take the Obama mandates, for example, a state like Ohio should nullify that law. And maybe, just goes so far as say, we're just not going to enforce this. I mean, is that a natural remedy? Is that something that fits into this view that if something goes out of line of the originalist view, it should just be nullified, and that's the next step?
If you really are an originalist and you go to the founders, the answer is yes, they were thinking of remedies that we think today are absolutely implausible. And one of them was state nullification. There's no doubt that it was part of it. I mean, they just come through, they came through problems with the articles, of course. But now no, that's where judicial review is coming. Judicial review is now our only remedy. Our remedy is a declaration from 9 justices on who was right and who was wrong. And so we don't have executive nullification or legislative nullification or state nullification or anything like that many of the founding fathers clearly bought into. Clearly. In fact, some of my favorite works on this stuff are by historians who say, some of the founding fathers, they made some errors. And it's hard for us to founding fathers. Yeah, they made some, and one of the errors was that in the procedural protections they put in the basic document, those procedural protections have proved to be insufficient. One of the procedural protections was the counterweight of the states on the federal government. And that has proved to be, in effect, because the Congress Clause has become so powerful, that the state as a they thought the states would control the federal government, not the court, the states would do it. The counterweight from the states. And that has proven to be an error. And there are other sort of instances. The original document didn't have the Bill of Rights because the Bill of Rights was added basically to get the thing passed. Because the original founding